As a lifelong New Yorker, a mom, and as someone who has worked my entire career to increase access to opportunity for communities of color, I've been so proud to be a part of our city's calls for justice around systemic racism. Now's the time for us to change the broken systems we have lived with all of our lives. We can make history in this extraordinary moment. We are ready to create a new social justice compact where every New Yorker has an opportunity to succeed and thrive. But that requires sustained energy, focused purpose, and honest, bold leadership. I've already been the first mayoral candidate to join with countless others in calling for divesting resources from the police and investing them in the people. I am committed to putting an end to the racist and oppressive systems that are failing all of us. But that's just a start. As we lead, so shall others follow. We are New Yorkers. We can do this. Together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Misha, for playing that. And it really kicks us off at a really good note in terms of being together. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. My name is Kristen. I'm a volunteer for Diane Morales for New York City Mayor. And welcome to our forum on radical reimagining towards a vision of true public safety. And this is actually just one of our first forums of a series of them that we're doing every month that is about reimagining what New York City looks like when the government serves all people, and putting the focus and the center especially on women, women of color, and vulnerable communities. So today, why we're all here is to learn about and have a conversation about the history of policing, what it means to really divest from police and invest in communities, how we will get there. And we're really excited. It's going to be kicked off by Diane Morales. She is a single mom of two, Afro-Latina, former educator, nonprofit CEO, and is running to be the first woman mayor of New York City. And scholar, activist, and educator Joy James, who we are so grateful to be here. And also, we want to open up that conversation to you all. We want to hear what questions you have for Joy and for Diane, and also just on the topic of policing and community safety. So before I pass this on to Chelsea, who will talk about our house rules, I want to say that we also want to extend this conversation to people online. So feel free to share your thoughts, share any quotes or any really interesting reflections using the hashtag Radical Reimagining. I'll share it and drop it into the chat. And now I will pass it over to Chelsea.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Was just muted. Thank you so much for being here. Just a few house rules, just so we can keep the conversation going and keep everything flowing. We just want to ask everyone, if you have a question, just please share that into the chat if you feel comfortable. Or you can send it directly to Sydney, and you can either put your name or you can remain anonymous with your question. We will go ahead and try to get to as many questions as we can, but we do have an hour together, so just be mindful. We will be filtering through to see maybe so the questions might be very similar. And we really do invite you to be present in this moment. We invite you to remove any distractions, just be curious, ask your questions, and just make space for everyone to feel comfortable as we talk about this discussion. And we will be putting some resources, some more information about Diane's campaign, more information about Joy's work in the chat, so just stay tuned for that. And again, we're excited, and let's start.
Yay, is that my cue?
That's your cue.
That's my cue. Yes, yes. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm going to start off by kind of reintroducing myself a little bit, or introducing myself to those of you who may not know me. I think there are quite a few folks, actually, who I haven't had the pleasure of interacting with before. So, I think that Kristen gave you a little bit of a sense of who I am. I'm an educator, I'm an advocate, I'm an organizer. I'm also a first generation Black Puerto Rican, born and raised in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, to a working class family. I'm a single mom of two college students, actually, that I'm very proud of. I'm the former CEO of an anti-poverty organization in the South Bronx, and I am the first Latina candidate for New York City mayor. I'm not a politician. I'm not a career politician. I'm not part of the machine. I'm not the anointed one of the establishment who has been self-selected as the heir apparent. I have spent my career actually working in the community, working on issues of poverty and unemployment, incarceration, and recognizing that all of these issues have impacted Black and brown communities in disproportionate numbers, particularly in households led by women. And as a single mom, these things are of particular interest and concern to me. I've spent my career actually helping to increase access to academic and economic opportunity for historically oppressed communities. And I've had quite a bit of success in that. I think for the most part, I've worked in organizations where I've been able to grow the number of people served, where we've been able to track the data and show that people were actually succeeding. That being said, it felt to me that I spent a lot of time tinkering around the edges, not really having an impact on the structural and systemic barriers that create the need for the types of services and programs that I've been providing and working on throughout the course of my career. And that's partially because the system is working exactly as it's intended. But I also believe in the power of collective action. And I believe in the possibilities that we can create together, because I believe that government is supposed to belong to us, and that it is our right to demand that our leaders stop operating in ways that perpetuate the status quo. And so I think it is important for all of us to lean in. And, I made the decision to run for office because I believe that democracy is actually the mechanism by which we can preserve and protect human rights, with a specific eye and lens towards those who have been historically left behind. Because I don't think that a system that works for some of us is good enough. And I think that in order for us to change that, we need to find a way to make believers out of those who the system has historically failed. I think that we are living at an unprecedented time. I know that we're living at an unprecedented time in my lifetime. I think that the diverse coalition of folks that have come together across this country and across the world demanding change is unprecedented. And I think that we have the possibility and the potential to harness the power of our collective participation and engagement to really push for change. I know that I'm not going back. I'm not going back to the way things were. And I know that we cannot keep doing things in the same old way and expect that we're going to create real change. And so this is my big act. This is the thing that I am doing in my lifetime to try to help create real mass scale systemic change for the communities that I am from and the communities that I have spent my life working with. The conversation today is focused around this issue of policing and law enforcement. Over the last, several months, the pandemic of COVID combined with the exposure of the pandemic of racism has really sort of changed the conversation and has opened people up to this conversation around defunding or divesting and reinvesting. There's so many different ways that people are referring to this, and I think language matters, and that's one of the things that I'd like to spend some time talking about. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest, who I'm very, very excited to have here with us. I'm excited to have this conversation today with the scholar, activist, and revolutionary freedom fighter, Dr. Joy James. Dr. James is an Ebenezer Fitch Professor of the Humanities at Williams College, specializing in political theory, critical race theory, and feminist theory. Her impressive list of works, including accredited books, journal chapters, and more, critique incarceration and policing while examining the perspectives of social justice advocates, human rights advocates, and political prisoners. I think that her passion about the intersection of race, gender, and class, especially as it relates to our prison system, makes her an integral and critical part of this conversation today. So thank you for joining us today, Professor James. Welcome.
Thank you. And thanks, Diane, for creating this forum, but also being you. I mean, you talked about the big acts, and I'm not, in my heart, I'm a revolutionary, freedom lover and fighter. But I think a lot of it is the little acts too, right? For many of us who won't be center stage but can express our courage in other ways. So I'm really happy to have this dialogue and see your collective, your crew, in action as well. So yes, I don't know how you want to start this discussion about policing, particularly, what you've said about New York City. I mean, so much of it has been around disposability. In terms of, we know the disparities of, at times could call them the expendable, essential workers, right? I mean, they're the people who keep the city moving. They're the people who can't say, well, I need to go to my second house, or I need to go to another state or something. I mean, they're the foundation of the city itself, but, based on the fact that they're viewed as interchangeable, right? In that way, they're disposable. And I think that also applies to policing as well, that people of color, undocumented people, working class people, poor people bear the brunt of the loss of jobs, bear the brunt of insufficient, adequate health care, and they bear the brunt of policing and the violence and the racial and sexual dynamics, which are predatory within that violence. They and their families bear that brunt as well.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for raising that. As the single mother of a brown boy, I've lived in fear for his safety for the 22 years that he's been walking this earth, and I think that fear for me has been validated on a variety of different occasions when he's been profiled or harassed by the police. As recently as May 29th, when we were at the first sort of major George Floyd protest that took place at Barclays Center here in Brooklyn, and I was there with my kids, and they were sort of standing about 50 feet ahead of me because they're young adults, so they don't want to be seen at a protest with mom. And I watched in horror as they were sort of standing there and got pepper sprayed. Completely unprovoked. And, we were able to obviously, recover from that. But then as we marched on that night, ended up actually being kettled or surrounded or whatever the right term is. And I think deliberately separated from the white friends that we were marching with, my children and I. And my son was then assaulted by an officer. And so, I think for me as a candidate for mayor, my personal experience and those are the communities that I've served very much inform my position around these issues, right? And so I'm really grateful to you for being here and sharing this in this conversation. I was hoping that maybe we could start with you telling us a little bit about your, how you sort of entered this space in this conversation. You were a scholar activist around these issues. What was it in your life that sort of brought you into this? And what role you think, the role of race it plays in policing, the history, right? Let's start there, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. I mean, decades ago, I was a graduate student in New York City, and it was then that I first met Angela Davis, who came to the city from California to give a talk, right? But I'd also been, active. I mean, I was ditching my classes too, so it's surprising that I got a doctorate. But anyway, so, because the city's compelling. I mean, it's an educational school in itself. And if you really want to see how power works and also how violence works, then you have to be in the communities and you have to be in the streets. So I was living in Brooklyn at some times, Washington Heights at some times. We were protesting against police violence in the 1980s, right? In the 1990s. I remember going to court. I was organizing with a group of women in Park Slope in Brooklyn, and we managed to be some of the few civilians to get in court during the Central Park case. And, we sort of know from Ava DuVernay's very emotional, rich film that Oprah, backed, and before that from Ken Burns's documentary. But, people aren't always listening, as what you said happened to your son about the trauma that's associated with interactions with policing. People don't always believe what our communities say, what our youth say in terms of what is happening to them. But at that time, there was a lot of debate, there was a lot of tension. Yusuf Hawkins, there was so much that was going on, and this sense of you had to depend on the police, sort of that feeling that's growing again now because of the shootings, right? Because they're the wall between chaos and stability, rather than, they may as well be part of the problem in terms of a structured chaos, right? So it was from organizing, it was from listening to Davis, it was later going to California on a postdoc, and that's when I got introduced to abolitionism. Organizing a conference at University of Colorado Boulder. When I was there, she asked me to do a prototype for critical resistance. And so my politics are a little different maybe from, there are different types of abolitionists.
Right.
But I'm grateful, that what I learned from this city and organizing and what I learned from people on the other coast in terms of their dedication to human rights and civil rights, that it gave me courage to kind of not just imagine or reimagine a better world, but also figure out how to struggle and fight for it.
Yeah, that's great. And I definitely want to get into, I'm taking notes, definitely want to get into and unpack the different versions of abolitionism. But I wonder can I put you on the spot? Can you help folks, just so that we're all starting off the conversation in the same place, the history of policing, right? Where did that come from? That whole thing.
Sure. So if you look at some of the abolitionist texts, they've been talking about it a lot. In fact, there's a blog coming out next month with the African American Intellectual History Society, AAIHS. We've been writing or addressing the queries from people inside of prisons, and as academics writing responses, and so that's posted. But the history goes back to the 18th century, if not before, and it's tied to slave patrols. And so really, as humans, we were also cargo, we were also property. And if property wanted a life, in order to avoid violence, rape, losing one's children, then one left, right? But then patrols would come and find you, and then drag you back, if they did not kill you on the spot, as an example for, not trying to be free and to live with dignity as a child of God. So the slave patrols evolved over time, right? After abolition in terms of chattel slavery. The slave patrols evolved into police forces. So I think the NYPD was formed in the 19th century, maybe around the 1840s or so. But the mission of controlling people of color, and it's not just Black people, indigenous people were hunted down too, right? In all ethnic groups, right? As they try to assimilate or don't assimilate working class poor people, the need to control labor, to control property that's human, is basically the mainstay, and use this term I will, DNA of modern policing. So to undo that centuries-old project is massive. And I think that's why you get this language today that's very bold. Like, how do you reform something that's been functional for centuries and actually will not acknowledge its origins as well as its function in terms of preserving property as wealth, whiteness as property or existential wealth, corporations, you know, no matter what they do in terms of devastating the climate or communities. If they're the, you know, as the POTUS 45 would say, if they're the foundation and also the wall that separates us from chaos and anarchy, so to speak, I say they're also the wall that separates us from freedom and loving and caring communities.
100% agree. And that segues nicely into the other thing I wanted to talk about, you know, so one of the things we are rolling out today on the Diane.nyc website, a few big ideas around my platform around policing. And part of that I've been talking about for a while. I've been talking about the idea of, again, divesting and reinvesting, right? Reinvesting in our communities towards a new vision of public safety, which is exactly what we're here to talk about. You know, one of the things that we did actually, and we'll share the word cloud shortly, we posted yesterday on our social media channels asking folks to describe to us what their vision is of public safety, right? What does the world look like? There are communities that are considered safe. And what do you see in those communities? What are the resources available? What do things look like? And so I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about, right, the difference between reform, right? There's people that are talking about reform versus the defund / abolish. It's kind of a continuum, is the way I think of it. And why is it that reform really isn't a viable strategy, right? Why, you know, I want people to understand why I'm not talking about or using language about reforming the police department. There's a big thread on Twitter because I posted something yesterday and people are, you're using, you know, this is the wrong language for you to be using. It's incendiary and it's problematic. And, you know, but I think people need to understand something, right?
Right. And I wasn't being dismissive if you saw a slight shrug. I mean, in terms of what's incendiary, it's just how vulnerable our lives are in this moment, right? And you talked about twin pandemics, I mean, COVID-19, but also police violence. And I think one of the things we have to face is our fear, right? Because it's our fear that keeps our imaginations like locked up in little boxes, and our fear that leads us not to trust the youth, right? Even though the future is theirs and they have to inherit, you know, that's like in air quotes, like climate devastation, inequality of wealth, human trafficking, I could go on. But they also inherit our love and our concern and our attempts to do the best that we can as elders. And so one of the things we can do, which is not that difficult, is to create a language that walks away from reform. Reform does not work. Yeah. So we have these massive movements, right? From the 1950s, we can say civil rights movement, Rosa Parks. I mean, we can just go, let's track. And remember, Rosa Parks says that she did not give up her seat because of the lynching of Emmett Till. Like, somebody lost a 14-year-old child who was tortured by self-deputized vigilantes, right?
Yes.
And it's that loss of family, kin, community is what creates movements that cannot use old language that is meaningless if politicians keep reproducing the norm. Right. So was that incendiary for her to not give up her seat? Absolutely. Right. And it started a movement that led to civil rights gains, that led to voting rights. Mm-hmm. But we always have to protect what we fight for. Right. So if we see so much of what, you know, we thought was stable from, you know, John Lewis just passed, right? People talked about his head being bashed in. People fought, some people died, right? Yeah. Some people lived with trauma, passed it on through generations. Yeah. But we achieved, but our achievements are never stable if we're timid. Right. So we need bold language. And basically, all we're asking is for control over the police, community control over the police. If you have to do it through their budget, that's the nicest way to do it.
Right, right. Absolutely. And so one of the things that, I've spent my life working in service to the community is the way I would describe it. And, I'm advocating for and pushing for the idea of, again, divesting, reinvesting, whatever and really providing and creating a vision of public safety that is focused on providing the communities with what they need, right? Mm-hmm. Making sure that our communities have stable housing and the economic integrity that they need in order to live in dignity, access to food and, food and shelter, childcare, healthcare, quality healthcare. These are the things that, these are the things we see in other communities that are not Black and brown and low income, that are not heavily policed. These are the things that the resources that they have access to. And thinking about what it looks like and how our communities can really move towards this public safety is an exercise that I think I'd like to bring all New Yorkers along with me on, right? And thinking about moving away from this militarized, over-policed state so that we are creating communities for everyone where everyone really has the opportunity to thrive. I'm wondering if my team can throw up the word cloud that people created, because yeah. I mean, so, when asked unencumbered, right, without the sort of predetermined kind of barriers or limitations to what safety is supposed to mean, these are the things that people came up with.
Right.
This is what people are, and it's exactly what I think we're talking about, right? This isn't reforming policing. This is really sort of creating a whole new reality for our communities in terms of providing these services.
And also, I mean, this is great visual, right? This is everything we're entitled to as humans. I mean, these are our rights. I mean, nice colors, nice positioning, but literally you mapped out our rights. And here's the problem. Even for people who are conservative or want to be fiscally responsible, right? Which we all do. We all have budgets. We have kids. We have elders. We need to, take care of ourselves and take care of our families. The policing that we have right now is not economically sustainable. I mean, you could look at the amounts of monies. I mentioned the Central Park case earlier. That was millions of dollars in settlement. For Eric Garner's, when he was murdered on Staten Island, that was, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but maybe that was a $4.5 million settlement, including attorney's fees. All the money you're going to have to pay from all the protesters who were abused by the police is taking money from after-school programs, from youth employment, from elder care, from food security, from health. I mean, it's not even rational to allow such a large apparatus that has a $6 billion budget, right, to go unmonitored. Right. And in fact, over the years, I think time and time again, the police have been given a green light. Their unions function almost as a protective association, right?
Yes.
ProPublica just gave us the data from the 50A repeal, where you got to see how there's a segment of, you could call them rogue police, or maybe this is their mission to intimidate and basically terrorize certain communities that are under-resourced. And all you're seeing is money going down the drain. And trauma, and one last thing I want to add and then stop. I mean, there's already studies that have been done by educators at Harvard and elsewhere that if you have an unarmed person shot, that it has an impact on infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates, because it's irrational to the community. They sort of understand that if somebody has a weapon and police need to defend themselves, then that's a logical association. But when you have unarmed people, die in the way that Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and scores of others before that, it really has an impact on pregnant women. They did the data. Their babies don't thrive, they're low birth weight because of the stress. And we could talk again about why some communities died at faster rates under COVID because of hypertension and stress. Right. So it's like a deadly cycle that we have to fund out of our tax dollars, which is irrational. So I think defunding, if you don't like the language, come with better language, always open to prose. But it's an irrational system that's deadly to our survival.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is so well said. Very, very well said. Thank you. So I'm watching time, and I want to make sure that we give some time to folks to interact with us. But I can't stop our conversation without asking the question of, like, why do you think it's been so hard to overcome this system? Why is it? What are your thoughts about leadership? Right? I mean, I'm. Like I said at the beginning, right, I'm not part of the political establishment, so I kind of feel like I don't have anything to lose, right? If I jump, I understand that there are forces and all of that stuff, but I also, I'm unencumbered, I'm untethered, I don't owe anybody anything, and so, I feel like I have the ability to bring a level of sort of bold and unapologetic, position and perspective on this. But what are your thoughts about sort of?
Yeah, so this is a conundrum of democracy, right? I mean, we know its origins, like, genocide against indigenous, right? Enslavement of Africans, exploitation of, of workers, breaking apart trade union. It's just consolidation of wealth. And it's okay to work hard and earn things and have good things, but based on exploitation and violence, no. But along with the evolution of democracy based on these origins, right, you do have professionalized politicians. Like, however we want to romanticize, like, I'm old enough to have watched those old black and white movies, Mr. Smith Goes to Wherever He Went, Congress. But, we know that voting is not enough. Like in 2015, Sanders caught my eye. So then, I tried to organize. In 2008, Obama caught my eye.
Right.
And I know people love Obama, so that's good. I'm not playing you right on this one. But like, Obama also received more from corporate donors. He broke the record. So that it's very interesting and easy how politicians who start off on a progressive note can be sucked in. I think like AOC, I think other people are staying outside of that current. They're not going to be swept away. But in a way, we have to vote, we have to be engaged, but we can't think that politicians by themselves, without backing from strong communities who are very clear about their rights, can make any headway in a democracy that was corrupted from the day it was born.
Right. That's exactly right. And I think that that's part of why, for us and for our campaign, for our sort of little engine that could campaign, that brought in more, donations from New York City residents in this last filing, over three times more, I have to say that, than any other mayoral candidate on, primarily $10 contributions. I think that's what we're counting on, right? We're counting on sort of that tide and that surge to sort of to push this through in a different kind of way and to send a message to the establishment about what our city is ready for and what we're not going to put up with anymore. So the last thing I want to ask before we open it up to folks is, like, what are your thoughts about what that transition, right? So, we win and we're in office and we're starting to work on dismantling the current system. What are your thoughts about what that process should look like to move from this current status to like a true, just, and safe state of being for all communities?
Well,
where do we start?
Yeah, I know you have a whole team, and so you have economists and you have policy analysts. So I'm just talking as, a citizen, who cares? Like a lot of people. There are 8 million people in this city. In part, I think it's tied to decriminalization, like, decriminalizing sex work, decriminalizing, even though they say they've decriminalized marijuana, and so it's still like when police have these quotas, right? Or they just have racial animus or animosity against poor people. Like there's all kinds of biases in this country, right? That are festering, you know, because there's a rise of white supremacy, there's like concentrated billionaire caste and classes. But, you know, understanding that people need help and support more than they need punishment. But having said that, people also need security. So you don't want to be caught between a rock and a hard place. You don't want to be caught between police violence and criminality and civilian violence and criminality, right? So part of this really has to do with a strong administration coming in that has more than rhetoric and platitudes, and that will listen to the communities when they talk about their needs. And the needs will change based on class, based on whether you're a property owner or not. But the fundamental need to have human decency and dignity is a staple. And the need to be cared for and to care for other people is just a core human value.
Yeah.
But I would think first there, you know, bring a broom. And I mean, so much of women of color, we're always domestic workers, emotional laborers, but yeah, be prepared to clean house. Because, you know, bureaucrats do bureaucracy, and entrenched power keeps on wanting to be entrenched. And so whether it's a civilian review board over police, whether it's a commissioner who still reports to the mayor but is not a police officer who rose through the ranks, it's somebody who can manage and talk to people and serve the city because they're supposed to be servants of the community. There's a whole host of things. And one last thing I would say, I've just heard in different ways for so many groups that talk about those of us who are differently abled. And disproportionate, it's people with, you know, disabilities, people who don't, you know, when you give a command, they don't register, or their social effect is maybe to run rather than to be passive, or, you know, so people who are, you know, labeled as disabled, and if they want that term, fine, I say differently abled, right. Emotionally, from trauma, from coming out of these horrid prisons, there has to be a level of investment in their care and reintegration into families so that they're sustainable and so that they understand they belong. But in fact, for that to happen, predatory economics and predatory policing have to be banned.
Yep. Yes. And so I will wrap this up before we open up for Q&A by saying that is exactly why I think that I am the right person to be the New York City mayor. I have dedicated my career to caring for people and caring for communities. And I think that we need to fundamentally shift the orientation of really serving the community. And for those of us that have that experience and have that background and have that orientation, that is what we're ready for. I believe that is what we're ready for. I believe it's our time. And, you know, moreover, I think if you combine that with the experience of actually being an executive, right? Getting people to buy into a shared vision, getting people to work together, to collaborate, bringing everyone and giving everybody a seat at the table to help be part of creating the solution and the vision, and being invested in the positive outcome and being invested in the long term. I think, you know, those kinds of things have been so far overlooked in terms of politics and leadership, and we really need, it's really our time. I really believe that it's our time, and that we need to take it. We need to take the thing that has been denied to us, that belongs to us in so many ways. So I want to thank you for this conversation. We're not done. I want to open it up to questions. I don't know who's doing this for our team, but somebody is going to give us some questions and we can continue the conversation between us.
Yes. Hi all. Sorry, we're trying to figure out the technical difficulties with Google being able to message me directly, but so far we did get some questions in the chat. So the first one being from CMR, and they asked, how do we ensure equity and criminal justice for Black trans women specifically as a community?
I mean, I'll take a stab at this, and then I would love to hear your thoughts as well, Joy. I mean, my thought is, you know, Joy actually referred to this in talking about, you know, I don't know if we're talking about sex work, decriminalizing sex work here, decriminalizing, you know, getting rid of the walking while trans ban, you know, those kinds of issues, making it safe, making it possible. I don't know, I'm not sure we're talking about criminal justice because the Black trans community isn't inherently criminal. I think that's sort of step number one, right, is destigmatizing, decriminalizing their existence and their ability and their right to exist. That is in and of itself a huge step that has to be taken in terms of providing equal access and rights and equity for our Black trans community. The rate at which they're experiencing violence and you know, murder is unacceptable, and we need to ensure safety through first ensuring their rights as well. I don't know, Joy, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo what you said, but I also want to add a bit of history. I mean, there are historians who've looked at the Women's House of Detention, where Angela Davis was held when she was arrested in 1970. But Afeni Shakur, Tupac Shakur's mother, was there as part of the Panther 21. They were framed by COINTELPRO and the FBI. But when Marsha P. Johnson at Stonewall in '69 were rebelling, Afeni helped organize a rebellion simultaneously inside the Women's House of Detention, where the women ripped their mattresses apart, they set fire to them, they threw things out the windows, and it was in solidarity. And so I would say, like, this notion of community is broader than we often want to remember, because like the history of fighting together gets lost, and it's not even about separate people. I mean, we are a community, right? Yes, if it's about legal issues around decriminalization, or, you know, the church that I go to has one of the few Black trans, well, it's not necessarily Black, but teen trans shelter in the city. And recently, you know, I need to check in with the pastor, but they were given a notice because it, you know, there was an open kitchen, you could stay for months, like it was a shelter, right? And so when we go into mass, there's like an altar of Black trans women in the shape of a cross, and is an odd juxtaposition because the church is really old, so there are these white alabaster angels hanging around, right? But there's like this mindfulness about our vulnerabilities, but also those who are the most vulnerable among us from social violence, not just from police, but from other people in our community. So, but also I'm hearing, or I heard during the pandemic, and, you know, I'm putting in air quotes because I don't have the data on it, but there's a possibility that the city might have sent out like letters of notification that you can't have these private shelters, that you cannot offer sanctuaries, right? Because there's a desire to kind of push everybody who doesn't have the resources, who've been kicked out of their homes from their families, who don't accept, to sort of push them into custodial care of the state. So we have to fight on a number of levels, that everybody has secure housing, that they have food, that they have the support they need, the education they need, but that they're not preyed upon, either from the civilian sector or from the police sector. And again, we pay the salaries of the police. So if they can't stop harassing people, they don't need to be employed as city employees. They can find a job somewhere else and do something else. But also we need to change ourselves in terms of our communities. And I will ask one other thing, because I mentioned teens. We also have to have more mindfulness about children. Like the schools are kind of treating them as human capital or as detritus or disposables, right? And yes, children who are trans, children who are differently abled, and I'm not equating the two, right? Children who are diagnosed with these different conditions, children who are traumatized, which is across the board, are, for Black children, our suicide rate has gone through the roof.
Right.
And that's, you know, because of transphobia, homophobia, and just under predatory economics and predatory policing in and out of the household by the public and private sector, the vulnerabilities are mounting. And so, yes, we have a lot of work to do on ourselves and a lot of work to do in our communities, but it'll be much easier if we can control policing and bureaucracy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question that was asked is actually about Black and Brown youth specifically. So perfect transition from what you were just talking about. So the participant asked, what can be done to bridge the gap in public safety by creating restorative justice spaces throughout the city to engage in practices in order to heal, mend, and restore the New York City community, and specifically talking about youth that have been criminalized?
Yeah. So I was having a different conversation yesterday. I'm on the board of an organization that has been around for almost 100 years and focused on inner city youth who are emotionally disturbed. And they were talking about restorative justice. I think one of the things that I, even in the framing of that, have a little bit of an issue with is that it's still sort of based on the premise of that problematizes our children, our Black and Brown children and youth. Like they need to be, we need to restore them so that they cannot be this, as opposed to the framing of first we need to provide the right supports and the right resources and the things that all children need to thrive. And once we're doing that, then let's talk about, okay, once we're providing all of the basics and all of those foundational things that every child needs, then we can talk about how we deal with, when a child digresses or when a child has a disciplinary issue or whatever. But even the premise of going from sort of criminal justice to restorative justice still puts, to me, centers the problem on the Black and Brown youth. And I think that we really, yes, of course, restorative justice is a better approach than the criminalization of our Black and Brown youth. And still, I feel like we're not getting to the issue. The real issue is that we're not providing our Black and Brown youth with the resources and supports that they are entitled to and that they deserve. And so until we really start there, that's what I'm pushing for, and that's what I believe in. And I think that's what we need to focus on and prioritize first.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that was part of the language of defunding the police, however people feel about the phrase. I mean, it's a hashtag, don't get emotionally attached to hashtags, right? But what you do is you take a part of the budget and you reallocate it to your national treasure or your international treasure, which is your children. And not your own biological children, but children writ large, right? It's just, that's it. I mean, you're kind of here to help people grow up. And so, we know about disproportionality. I used to live in Texas, and that's what we called it there. But disproportionately, Black children are removed at higher rates, even though their families are no more dysfunctional, right? And disproportionately undocumented, even people who are documented but who've immigrated and have to start over, they're more vulnerable to be unhoused and so most likely to be policed. So social workers can be part of policing apparatus, right?
Absolutely.
And they're joined at the hip with police. I'm not saying that all children are safe in all homes. I am saying that the way the bureaucracy operates is not to preserve family or to deal with the emotional landscape of a child. It is about controlling environment and controlling bodies. Go back to the 18th century, right? So this is a huge investment. I'm not going to call it human capital because it sounds like kids are robots and you're just training them to work for Amazon or something, right? But this is a huge investment in the future. And that means that you're going to have to shift funds from other areas and invest. But also, what would it be like to have a freedom school as your local school? It can be your public school, but what's taught in it actually allows the child to see themselves in the curriculum, to understand their value, and to want to contribute to community. And that is like the healthiest mental and emotional diet on one level, to just de-escalate violence inside of communities and throughout society.
Right. The last thing I'll add to that is that what you just described, the word that popped in, that comes to mind to me when I think about that, is healing. There's also a tremendous healing that comes with creating and providing the resources and supports to our children so that they are able to see themselves in a whole different kind of light. And we're talking about generations and generations of healing that is necessary, particularly in our communities. And so, you know, I was struck by the vivid image that I got in my mind as I listened to you talk.
And think of it. I mean, we're already doing that labor. It's just unpaid labor, right? And there are like people, clergy and others who are on the streets who are trying to get, you know, turn in your guns, turn in your weapons. That's not necessary. And I'm not saying everything should be paid or monetized, but people who are doing that caretaking for communities and families and elders and children and, you know, the natural environment, that they should be seen as valued workers, and budgets should be adjusted to make sure they have everything they need to continue working.
Love that. I love that. Sid, you got a few more questions for us?
Yes. So there were two questions, one from Gabby and one from Paul, that both were revolving around the issue of like, how do people who are getting involved in abolitionist work and everyday citizens, what are the next steps to get involved, and how do we build a larger consciousness in our communities? And as well, there was a question that was directed at specifically Diane, your campaign, and what you're doing around abolition, or like who you're working with to create next steps and ideas.
So I can start with that. I have been working with a couple of groups on the ground. New York City Fight for Our Lives is an activist organizer group that I've been connected with. Actually, it was through a fellow organizer in that group that I was introduced to Joy. They're organizing both sort of protests and actions and demonstrations. I think there's, you know, that's one thing. And I think that's a necessary act just at this point in time in terms of maintaining the visibility, maintaining the pressure, maintaining the discomfort, I think that's really important. I think on the, you know, the flip side of that, not the flip side, one of the other sort of tracks is really sort of goes hand in hand with this conversation, building out the sort of what the pathway looks like. What does it look like for us to move from where we are right now in this overly militarized, overly policed situation to a state where we are providing the resources and supports to our communities and our children and our youth that they need, right? And what does it take to grow that movement? What does it take to engage in and have conversations with others to help them understand the vision that it is that we're moving towards and that we believe in and buy into? We have got to actually really, really create a groundswell movement of folks who are bought into this idea to push. And, you know, I'll say this in terms of, you know, I was talking about before about what I should do, you know, early on when I get elected and start implementing these things. One of the things that I think is really, really important is we're building this movement for the campaign. But once we get people elected into office that we believe in, our work isn't done, right? And so, you know, if we're successful here, I'm going to need everyone who helps make that possible to stay just as engaged and just as invested in maintaining the movement, in maintaining the pressure. Because it's, you know, we're talking about trying to push back against literally centuries of ingrained, institutionalized, systemic oppression. And so, you know, it's not going to happen in one election. There's no one person who is going to serve as the silver bullet, pun intended. in addressing this challenge. So, you know, that's one of the things I would say, and I would invite and welcome anybody who is interested in sort of helping and working on the campaign around this to please get involved. I'm pretty sure the team is probably flooding the chat with ways for you to do that, but this is something that we are co-creating together. I have my ideals, I have my values, and those things are unshakable, but I also know that the problems that we have are often, the solutions to the problems are often closest or held by the people who are dealing with those issues and those challenges most on a day-to-day basis. So, Joy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I mean, what you said, you know, I can't say anything really about policy, but just, you know, so as a teacher, I just want to point in the direction of a couple of things. So ProPublica got the files, and I think it was 3,000 to 4,000 of substantiated or credible NYPD complaints. And if I recall the numbers correctly, but you can always search to verify. So out of 3,000 that they, you know, substantiated themselves, something like 73 were accepted by the NYPD because they have their own mechanism. So basically the police are policing themselves, and it's like you wouldn't let your 2-year-old like monitor themselves. So like, why would you do the police? And I'm not trying to disparage them. I'm just saying that they're doing their own thing with no oversight. And of that, there were like 9 disciplinary actions, which were largely about losing vacation pay. Right. So if you have a $6 billion industry, which damages people and costs you more based on lawsuits, you know, tied, you know, we've talked a lot about violence, but it was only in the last year or so, if I remember correctly, that a law was passed that said a police officer, NYPD, could not have sex with somebody they arrested. Because if you're arresting somebody and you're having sex with them, you're raping them, essentially. But you couldn't convict anybody because there was nothing on the books. So in a way, the 19th century culture is still embedded in this apparatus. So to fund our needs, the needs of our children, the needs of our grandparents, our parents, is going to take a lot of courage. And that's cool, Diane, if you're like, you want to do that and your crew, like, I'm inspired by that. But it's going to be daunting, and you're right, it will lead a mass group of mobilization that says we deserve more than what we're receiving. Mm-hmm. And one last thing is, I believe AOC, you know, I'm doing the acronym on her, I could say her own name anyway, in a tweet said that there were 118 billionaires in New York City. Yep. Cuomo is not taxing them. Right. That means the deficit in the state budget, the deficit in the New York City budget will be borne by the working class and the middle class, which means we are the safety net for the poor and dispossessed. So our tax, and you know, I'm fine to pay taxes that don't go to war and don't subsidize billionaires and rogue cops. But that's not the formula right now. Right. So we've got to kind of reinvent in a way that is completely logical. So compassion is not a joke or imagining in the future. Compassion is a necessity with efficiency. And that's great if this campaign is dedicated to those endeavors.
Thank you. All right, I'm conscious of time. Sid, do we want to do one more question? Maybe?
Yeah, so there was another question that was generally what your thoughts were on the current moment, specifically in New York City, and that being attached to Occupy City Hall and the parallel movements.
So much to say about this current moment. I think that there is a convergence of influences, factors, dysfunctions that is, as I said, I think in my opening comments, sort of unique and unprecedented in my lifetime. That is both exposing the ugliness of racism, the ugliness of the policing state. I mean, there's, you know, I'm sure you all saw that video last night of the young woman who was abducted. I mean, it doesn't matter that they were NYPD. she was abducted. There was, when you think about what the procedures are supposed to be, none of that happened. It was all violated. And so, we are living at this really, really, I just feel like it's this intersection, and it is all of our ugliness is being exposed. And at the same time, it feels to me like there is a fissure in the institution and foundation of things that if we actually mobilize and push, we have unprecedented potential to make some change, right? So I think those two things are actually true at the same time right now. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And so I am counting on us actually really kind of leveraging that moment to break through and create some real change. But there are some horrors that are being exposed. I don't think they're new. I just think they're being exposed in a whole different kind of way. And yes, they've been escalated. And yes, they have been sort of given permission in some ways. And so they, they're sort of bigger. But these things, these dysfunctions aren't new. They're deeply rooted in sort of who we are and the society that we've built. And so this is a moment of reckoning for us. Is this who we want to be? I can't unsee some of the stuff that we've seen over the last couple of months. And that goes to my comment earlier about, I'm not going back. I don't know what it's going to look like moving forward, but I'm not going back there. So I think it's an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to make a collective decision about where we want to go from here. Joy?
Yeah, I would echo what you said. I mean, there's no back to go back to. It's gone. And I think that's why we're mourning and we're struggling at the same time, not just struggling to survive, but struggling to create a future. The economy is not what it was. Thousands of adjunct, I'm fortunate because I'm tenured, but thousands of adjunct professors were fired. Even at the private Ivy schools, they protect their endowment first. Sure. And so they're letting people go. Humans are now just cogs in a big machine. There's nothing to go back to that isn't burning. And so it's just collectively, we hold hands and we walk through embers and, we see what we can plan on the other side. But it's exactly like you said. We don't have a choice. Sitting still is an ostrich, like you want to be an ostrich, go ahead, but it's still moving ahead without you, and better for all of us to join, to share our wisdom, share our compassion, share our courage. So I'm glad I met you.
Me too.
That's all I can say. I just met you today, but.
Thank you. So I think I'll wrap up on that note of what I think is there's a little bittersweetness to it, right? I think there's an acknowledgement of this moment, and of the pain and the sort of fires all around us. And also I think a sort of looking forward and looking ahead to what is possible. And I'm sort of hoping and kind of putting a stake in the ground and counting on the collective rising. And rising to a new possibility and a new vision, a reimagining of what it is that we want for ourselves and for our community. So I want to thank you, Dr. Joy James, for joining us today. I am so honored to have had the opportunity to have this conversation with you, and I think this is the beginning of something. I look forward to staying in touch with you. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Really, really appreciate your time and your interest. If you are interested in getting involved in the campaign in any kind of way or supporting in any kind of way, please visit diane.nyc. Reach out. We want to hear your voices. We want to amplify your voices. And so please stay in touch. Please stay connected. This is the beginning of what will be a sort of monthly series of forums. We started with policing and law enforcement today. In August, we will be focused on education for Black liberation. And then in September, we are going to be talking about women, which is sort of like talking about everything, because women, there's no issue you can talk about and not funnel it back to women. But thank you all for everything and for joining us, and look forward to staying connected. Thank you again.